Hello everyone. Hello. Um so I just realized that my audio settings are what they used to be with like a different mic. So if anything is not like great in terms of audio, let me know. Hello everyone. Yeah, so I've taken a penchant for choosing lecture topics um, based off of what I see the most often in some of the Nordic Go Dojo games. Um, there's a little background noise, but I think it's generally fine. Yeah, okay. I just realized it like 2 minutes before going live, and I thought, oh well. I guess it's too late now. So if it's generally fine, that's okay. Um, so yeah. One of the things that stood out to me the most from most NGD games that at least got to the end game, right, is that the end game is relatively low quality, and that's a phenomenon in a lot of amateur games, up to my level as well, that the end game is very much subpar. There are even strong players that have very, very subpar end games, it's, I think, a topic that I struggled with a lot until maybe like a year and a half ago when I started improving at it. And it's certainly not, it's not the strong point of a lot of people, which is interesting because I'd say that at the pro level, endgame is, a lot of people play endgame near perfectly, right? There's a very precise theory as to what the move values are. Set there's very set principles to play by. What endgame? I never see that in my games. Yeah, endgame is the punishment of not killing enough stuff in the middle game, or it's the reward for not dying with everything in the middle game. I'd see it that way. Um, so even though endgame is probably the easiest part of Go, in the sense that there's no part of the game that we are close enough to perfecting except for the end game. Like, there's none where we can try to attain so much precision as the end game, right? And the level of perfection that the top professionals have in the end game is really impressive. And I think it's probably the biggest incongruence between the play of really strong players and the average player. That the average player really doesn't know end game at all. And I think one of the reasons is probably that you guys don't get to practice endgame a lot. As Kini points out, endgame is like punishment for not killing enough stuff. That's sort of indicative of maybe what a lot of people think about the endgame. Like, you don't reach it. Like, something dies, someone resigns. There's a lot of reasons to not reach the endgame. You're not guaranteed to play it. I'd say that I myself play maybe 4 out of 5 times I play an endgame. And less frequently than that, I play an endgame where the endgame matters. Like, where the lead switches or the game gets close in the endgame. So yeah. Endgame is mostly about staying in Sente for as long as you can. That's one way to survive the endgame, and that's something I want to discuss, because certainly staying in Sente, so always making sure that you're playing, like when you play Sente moves, you're playing them for free, right? Because you spend a move, your opponent spends a move. And if you're not playing a bad Sente, you're making profit. So staying in Sente for as long as you can is safe, yes. But we're going to address that in the lecture, actually. Anyway, the point is, there's a lot of content, I think. I know some content online on YouTube, for example, or, there's, material on how to calculate the endgame online. Antti has a book on it, Rational Endgame. There's plenty of resources for what is the precise theory behind endgame. But I think that even though a lot of people know the theory, or have at least an idea of how you count moves and things like that, people still don't follow the exact counting principles during their actual games, because they don't practice. they're in Byoyomi, they're tired because they've been playing for 2 hours. So this lecture, I think, more than like precise endgame calculation kind of thing, I just want to go over some general principles of endgame that you can follow without doing precise calculation, because realistically, you're not going to be able to do perfect endgame calculation until you've done a lot of practice. I'm not too good at it still, even though I'm, doing my best to improve. Pascal Tremblay played on Pro or against another Aura 6 and was behind by 20 to 25 points when the endgame started. He told his professor to help, and he checked the situation. One move isn't enough, get up. And then Lee sat down and played the game until in the end and won by 2.5 points or so. Yeah, I mean, I know I know a 6-dan who's rather good at endgame, and he says he can be behind by about 25 points against a 2-dan in endgame and win. And that's probably correct. So the discrepancy is huge between the amateur ranks and the larger ranks. It's the biggest difference on the biggest difference between strong and weaker players. So the thing I wanted to start the lecture off with, now I've done my little, introduction preamble, is when exactly does the end game start, right? And actually this is a question I would extend to the audience. When would you think that end game begins? Is it a specific move number? Is it a specific time in the game? What is the move 5? Okay, great, move 5. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to put up a board position of a game I played a while ago. And I'll... a bit later than this, actually. Wait. Okay, so I chose this position here to ask the audience whether they think that this game is in the end game. Because, it's a game that's reasonably late, right? It's a move 189, actually. And it's actually a game that I played in 2019, early 2019, against Stanislav Ferelek. We were both just back from studying in China. It was a very violent game. I think the playstyle of the Chinese kids in the school sort of got to us. Chaos says when there's no groups in danger, as in nothing really urgent. Yeah, that could be a good description. That's sort of what I'm going to go with as a starting definition for endgame. Because I'm going to discuss when you're in endgame, you should go into this, or I suggest you should go into this mode where you're looking for these kind of moves, and you should be thinking like this. If you try that during the middle game, you're going to die with all your groups. So, Sander says, I don't think it's well defined, something around no large groups being in danger and lowish temperature, quote unquote. Yeah, I mean, no large groups being in danger, I believe, is a good start. Because, endgame, I think most people would see endgame as when you're closing the borders and when you're figuring out what the, let's say, what the details of the points are everywhere. And that's, that's probably good. I think another one that would be important is that most of the territory is already taken, right? Because all of those third line, there's games where there are no weak groups. I mean, technically, a board position after 4 moves has no weak groups. And there's plenty of board positions where there's nothing weak, but it's still the middle game. So I'd say that endgame is also it's it's to a certain extent intuitive when the end game starts. And roughly speaking, the way I would look at it is, yeah, weak groups is one of them, right? There's no weak groups to fight over. And next I think a good way to define it is, this is what you meant by temperature. Then there's higher temperature, value of the next move. Okay, I didn't know that term, temperature. I'd say the example game is not in the end game, e.g. large ko on the bottom left. Yes, exactly. So this game is at move 189, right? So most games are ending at move 189. You're playing 3-point endgame. So because we were we were and are rather aggressive players. This game went completely off the rails. And, White in the ensuing moves started a ko. I killed White locally. Stanislav started a ko. The game became a complete mess. If you skip to the end of the game, at move, I think, 278, right? White has killed my entire dragon on the top. And this other dragon, like, in case you hadn't noticed, this got cut off. Right? And the game ended with me resigning because I misread a Liberty race. And in this game, I don't think anyone ever got to play Endgame, right? I think it's a good example of maybe why Stanislav and I are better at fighting than we are at Endgame, because we get this kind of position a lot more often than the positions where you need to eke out a 2 to 3 point, lead to win the game. I think, of course, there are certain players that play for endgame. Like, I'd say someone like Lukas Podpera really loves the kind of game where the endgame margins are close. So you can be the type of player who makes endgame matter. That's true. And then again, there's other positions, such as the next one I'm going to show you. So this is actually from an NGD game, a recent NGD game that I reviewed, and I wanted to show this game. I'll show it later with like some examples of endgame because I thought it was actually an endgame that both players played really well. Like, both players are around strong single-digit Q, and they really played the game well. So, the endgame. Yeah, I like to make endgames matter. Yeah, I perhaps don't, let's say, or endgames mattering is a stressful moment, right? I feel more comfortable if the game matters in fighting personally, but it depends on the person. This game, I actually was thinking to myself, did the endgame start here at move 88, or did it start here a bit earlier at move 70? Because already here, I think some of the characteristics of an endgame position are already defined. Like, there's no weak groups. You could say that these stones are weak, or like, not that they're weak, but that they could be weak at some point, right? But in general, all of the borders are defined. All the groups are settled. You already have a good idea of how this game is going to end, just from looking at this position. So arguably, you're already in the endgame. You could define endgame by the way the player can analyze it, if given enough time. The player can predict accurately to the end, so the definition depends somewhat on the level of play. Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. On the other hand, correct me if I'm wrong, but I wouldn't think that, for example, two professionals, like even the best professionals, can take this position and analyze it until the end, right? But nevertheless, I think this is clearly an endgame position. It's very much, and Black already played so far like it's the endgame, right? If we look at these moves, which I think are fine, completely fine. They're just endgame moves. Black has already started closing the borders and stuff. And then he just strengthened the group, which really makes it, obvious that this is the endgame. I think, if any of you are familiar with the concept of, uncertainty, how much uncertainty there is on the board, I think that's also a good way to define it. There's no, if you have a good idea of what's going to happen to the groups, if you have a good idea what the points are going to be, it's a decent example of endgame as well. So now, I just wanted to have a little bit of a consensus on what, on when to start thinking about the endgame like it's the endgame. And then I wanted to get to a couple of examples, I think, of how to handle the endgame. I'm not going to be doing, counting. I'm not going to be doing endgame calculations, so this is very much an approximation of what correct endgame is, but I do hope to like discuss some principles that you can follow without counting. I see your point. Maybe we should distinguish the global endgame and the possible local endgames before that. Yeah, actually, that's something I hadn't thought about, because something that struck me here. This is actually not something I thought about mentioning in the lecture, but since you brought it up, if we go to this position earlier in the game, I was very surprised that the computer wanted to Hane here for white, right? Which looks like an endgame move. Of course, everyone knows that locally in this area, this Hane is a very crucial point for the endgame of this area. But I was surprised that the computer actually wants to play it immediately and not even capture the 2 stones. And I guess just because you're playing this endgame move doesn't mean that you're in the endgame. But it was just an interesting moment. The Hane looks bigger than a 2-space extension. This Hane, I certainly agree, because, this... when you play an endgame move, you always need to consider what follow-ups you have, because they add to the value of the move, of course. And, here this clamp is severe. Like, this clamp can't really be answered. Black just has to give up most of the corner. And in Black's case, the same shape applies, right? You just have this clamp, which is great. Of course, this clamp isn't so appetizing because white has nothing on the lower side, but it's still there. Yeah. So the first position I wanted to look at is from an NGD game. I think the 2 players are like strong double-digit Q. And I wanted to get to this position because, in my mind, this position is actually a very good example of an early endgame. You could argue that there's not endgame because I think some people see endgame as like, second line moves and things, and there's still the corners open and stuff. But in my mind, this is already an endgame. You're thinking of it like an endgame. And I'd ask the audience here, like, you guys, what is your instinct? Like, how would you start closing the borders here? Because there's no weak groups. How do you maximize your points from now on in this it's a detailed discussion already of who keeps points where, what the ending position is going to be. What game is this? This game is a game from the Nordic Go Dojo. Like, there's two players. Like, I think the 2 players are like maybe 12Q sort of thing. And they've played quite an okay game here. And for now, I think one of the players actually employed endgame principles quite well, and the other one made some mistakes. So one of the players ended up winning quite convincingly, even though this is a mostly even position. I think right now the position is basically even. It's okay for both. And eventually Black won by like 15 points or something. So Black played actually quite nice here. So some of the areas I would look at here as big points are certainly the corners, right? These corner enclosures are rather important. Some of the areas, J9 and Q3 pop out, but hard to tell. J9 and Q3. J9? J9. Bottom right first, R3. Q3. Yeah, Q3 is an interesting... Q3 is an interesting variation on invading the corner. I think it can also be done. Actually, I might discuss Q3 later, because the interesting thing about Q3 is that, okay, let's show what would happen if you played R3 first. So something like this is going to happen. Very roughly. White's gonna get a corner, and White's going to lose something on the bottom, but he's going to get a corner. And he's going to lose center. That's also important. And that's why I might discuss it in a bit more depth later. If you start by attaching, surely you keep less of the corner, but you do keep center. So there's an argument to be made always for something you can get in center. So that's something I might discuss later. I think R3 is urgent as black can slide from the top left to top left from both sides. So you're comparing, well, in this corner on the top left, this corner is open on two sides. So therefore the corner on the lower right is bigger because it's only open on one side. So like here you can somewhat consider any move in this corner miai. And that's actually reasonable enough. And I think so. I mean, for me, certainly the next move would be R3. And White instead chose to play O10 in the center. And O10 isn't an unreasonable move, because, I mean, look at this area, right? This area is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is quite a big area that White is threatening to take away. It's worth about 20 points, right? And White, later in the game, White tried to use the center points that he developed to make some of his own cash as well. So I think the move isn't quite unreasonable, but there are some issues to it. And it has to do basically with the concept of like if the efficiency of moves. So when you're a mega beginner, right, you're told that making points in the corner is the easiest, right? So for example, how many points does it take to make 1 point in the corner? Well, it takes 3 moves, right? And how many moves does it take to make points on the sides? Well, it takes 5. And to make a point in the center, it takes you 8 moves, right? So that's always a way that you're taught, well, that's why we take the corners first, the sides later, and then the center last, right? And that ties into the move that White eventually made in that game. Yeah, so here. And so if we consider this area, right, these 20 points, theoretically, Black could block and try to keep almost all of them, right? He's going to keep like 10, 11, 12, 13-ish of those 20 points. So if Black answers, White is successful because he just reduced like 5 points or so in center. But say Black doesn't answer, right? Say Black plays here, right? And then White follows up, right? And he jumps. And now we can say that Black doesn't really have many points in this area, like big area he used to have, because it's like, he's at most going to get, if later he plays here or something, he'll get 4 points, right? So his 20 points are basically gone. And I think that's why some players are attracted to the idea of playing in this big area, because it's like, I took 20 points, right? Now, the problem, I think, with this logic is that White spent 2 moves, right, to take all of this territory. And, let's say Black will get another move and he'll take the other corner now. And I think it's time to consider, well, how many points did Black gain per move comparing to White, right? Because that's one of the nice things about the endgame. The endgame is relatively easy to calculate. Well, not to calculate, but to play, because you stop needing to be concerned about groups. you do still need to be concerned about reading, but I would say that still to a lesser extent. There's still, fancy Yosei Tetsujis and things like that, but I say that those are somewhat the exception to the rule, and therefore it becomes so much about this efficiency discussion. How many points are you making per move? So, say that black. Well, let's go back to if white played here, and we go to this position. White probably took, and this is going to be some sort of detailed discussion, I guess, of point values, but white got like 6 extra points here, right? And he may have lost some points here. Like, let's say he lost. It's arguable he may have lost like these points. So white actually didn't make many points. His own cat, like, he got something, but he lost something, right? And on the other hand, black did lose a lot of points, which we're going to count now. Say here and here, black, like this corner of black's is now like this is like 21 points or something like that black made, and none of those were black's points before white played there. So in one move, white erased about 20 of black's points, right? So white also thought he erases 20 of black's points by playing in the center, but it took white 2 moves, and took black only 1, right? And this is why there's a certain endgame principle, which is that, generally speaking, the sides are larger than the sides are larger than the center, and it's even easier in this case, in some sense, because it's the corner, right, which we are taught is even bigger. And in fact, if we look at the way that this endgame progressed, so black actually answered in the center at first, but then white kept playing in the center, and black eventually took all the corner points. So already I would say this move is still not really following the endgame principle, because let's say that black, defends the corner again. It's very hard for white to keep all the center in one move. Like, he plays here, black can attach. There's all sorts of holes, right? I'd probably expect the border to be something like this. And then white kept like some 10 extra points, but it's not amazing. And the 2 corners are still, generally speaking, more urgent. Now, I do understand black here, because it's closer now, it's less clear. But the case is that eventually it was black who got around to the corner on the top left, and black also got around to the corner on the bottom right, which were the 2 really crucial points on the board. And eventually black won by, I think, 15 points or something like that, even though the game was even. So in only 25 moves, by focusing somewhat more on the corners, black ended up getting a huge lead. Well, white almost passed with D11. I mean, D11 on its own. Well, first of all, black is already winning before D11. That, even though D11, I agree, is a bit of a slow move. It does have a nice follow-up, but it's a small move, admittedly. But already black is winning. So black is, I think, here black's ahead by almost 20, and before white's mistake, black's ahead by 10 or so. Just because black got the top left corner already. So, yeah. The second example I wanted to show about what is mostly a topic of like the center versus the sides is of one of my own recent games against Valeri, Krushelnitsky. So we played like as part of an online tournament. So he's a strong 5-dan. And in this position, I have a slight lead, but it's certainly a winnable game for black. And I'd say it's a pretty clear endgame because black's 4 stones are dead. This group in the center is alive, and you'd start to look at some big endgame points that are on the board. So this is definitely a huge endgame point that I would look at. The interesting thing about this move, c3, is that I'd say that professional players valued it a lot back in the day, but the appreciation for this move has dropped in the days of computers. Like it's sort of been demoted to an endgame move instead of a middle game one. And well, some other moves I could think of are here, right? If white plays here, he closes off the entire center. Like, this center isn't a joke, right? It's a very big move. Yeah, f7, you suggested f7. f7's a big move. And something else I would look at is potentially something like going down at here. It's something like this. Just because... I'll give you an example. If white makes an eye, somehow, like, let's say black played here, which he didn't, and here, isn't d14 a problem for black? d14 shouldn't be. Wait, so, say I play d14. What's your plan against this move? So, if white wants to keep, like, pretending that he's taking eye shape, you need to play f13. Black pushes. You're gonna play here. And then, I think black, probably this attachment is good enough. Right? Yeah, this attachment's pretty crushing. Now, the interesting thing is that if black tried to push first, then white wouldn't have this trick. White still wouldn't have this trick because black makes an eye anyway. But the coolest way for black to refute this is here, I think. So if, white can't cut or anything because black just kills you. So white is sort of forced to play here, and then black gets an eye very cleanly. So this isn't really an issue for black. It's an issue for black in the sense that probably if white plays here or something, black is going to be a bit scared and he'll have to defend. That's true. But for now, black is completely fine. So, back to the topic at hand. So, let's say that black, plays on this 3-3, and white plays here. If black answers, white just got an exchange, it's fine. Or actually, maybe white should Kema. And then this is... White is getting a lot of extra points here, like the follow-up at t5 is big, and the most important thing is that if black doesn't answer, white's going to make an eye with his group. And the reason that that's important is that all of these points that white currently has to fix, like, usually white would have to win these points in a liberty race, right? But if white makes an eye, that's not the case anymore. So, this C area is actually surprisingly big. And the thing is, here, B is a relatively tempting move, and that's why I wanted to show this example as a not clear example. Because, the point I want to make, generally speaking, is that the center is smaller than the sides, and that a lot of people make this mistake of valuing the center very highly. But in this case, it's already not clear. So let's consider what happens if white plays something like this, then black is... Which move does black play? I think black... It's tricky because black can challenge white, sort of, here, and white can challenge to a ko. But I remember that during the game, I wasn't going to play this ko. This goes quite risky for white. And I didn't see that I have that much to gain from it, so my plan was mostly to let it go and do something like this. So, you know, I got some extra points here. It's hard to say how many, but, you know, let's... I think what the most useful thing that we can do is see how much black reduced white in the game, because eventually it was black who played there. So in the game, black also decided that this center area wasn't big enough, and we just played on the sides. I played some center moves, never a bad thing. Almost never a bad thing. And actually, the reason I played this exchange, like, S3 doesn't work, per se, because black will just go down, and I can't, like, kill him or anything. But the important thing is that now I can get an eye. And that's important for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So that's just a, like, cool endgame detail. In the end, black was the one who chose to play in the center. And I think... Oh yeah, this was probably unnecessary, let's say. It was just safe because I knew I was winning. But let's say what happens if white just plays here, right? I think actually, why would white play here? White is just going to keep ignoring. Like, this is bigger, you know, probably this is bigger. And then what's black going to do? The line is this, basically. And let's say that white's line of territory that he keeps is this. And sort of like this, because now black's hane will be rather severe, so, you know, white needs to keep that in mind. And that's actually why I protected K12 in the game. Like, in the game I chose to play it safe and just have no aji. Which is perhaps not strictly speaking necessary. Anyway, I think it's time to go back a bit to the point in the game where I could have chosen... Well, where either one of us could have chosen to protect in the center. So, here... Which one would black go? Black would play this one first, I think. Oh, whoops. And here, and here, and here. And after white defends, white has, like... This is like 12 points or so. Which is not bad, right? It's 12 extra points or so. And eventually in the game, I think black took all of those points. Black chose an interesting move. Like, he chose to Kosumi instead of Keima, which I'm not sure about. But, you know, say he plays this way, and later I'd say that the borders are going to be, you know, something, you know, very, very roughly this. I'm not being precise here. And actually here. And then black has taken about 12 points. And the thing is, this is a bigger center than most, because black has taken 12 points in one move, right? 12 points in one move isn't that bad. But if we consider it to something like c3, it's probably still smaller. Because c3 will, you know, after white plays it, white gets all of these points. After black plays it, he gets all of these points, right? Like, the move itself has a big follow-up. So, even though f7 is a tempting move, and I thought about it during the game, it's ultimately not big enough. So, in general, I do think that it's a very useful rule in the endgame. Like, when in doubt, when in time trouble, when you're tired because you've played a game for a long time, the corners go first, the sides go second, and the center goes last. And I think this endgame is actually a good application of those principles, because Black, he played some center moves. Maybe he thought they were favorable exchanges. Then he played in the corner. Whoops. Then I played some center moves. And, I played on one of the sides. And eventually he played on one of the sides. I played on one of the sides, and only then did he play in the center. And I think this is not exactly correct, but, quite precise endgame from both of us. So, but with that said, right, even though more often than not, I'm going to say 9 times out of 10, when you say I'm going to ignore the center and just make points on the sides when it reaches this endgame stage, because it's just more fundamentally sound. It's easier to make points on the sides. It's even easier to make points on the corner. Let's stay there. Did you check what the AI said about this, Jose? Yeah, it's quite, I think it's quite correct. I don't think the moves are blue, but the moves are fine. It didn't want to play in the center just yet. So I think what we may have been wrong on is which ones of the second line moves are bigger. For example, in my personal opinion, his Hane here is not precise. Because he was trying to sort of limit my eye space, but it ended up giving me this attachment, which was quite useful. So I do think maybe the choice of moves on the side wasn't perfect, but it was fine. I don't neither one of us played any really big mistakes in this endgame. The difference is 1 point, 2 points at most, or maybe a bit more. But I think it would have been a bigger mistake to play in the center than on the sides. That's perhaps my point. So back to the... Well, now I thought, okay, it's true that almost always it's better to play sides than center, but I did want to caution with a counterexample, because I would like to point out that it's not a hard rule. It's a hard, the only reason that the rule of sides before, corners before sides before center exists is because of the concept of efficiency of moves. So, in this game that I played, which is actually, I played this game very recently on stream. I was streaming, and I have a bit of a funny story about this way. So, I'd ask here, I was black in this game, and this game is about even, maybe white's a bit better, and I'd ask, what point on the board is urgent, in you guys' opinion. In the meanwhile, I'll mention something, which is that while I was doing this, while I was playing this game, I was streaming, and there was a guy in the chat who was like, "Oh, I'm scared that this will happen, that white will do this," and I'm like, "No, this isn't a problem. It's completely fine. I'll follow my endgame principles," and then I got completely destroyed by white in the way that he would say that, and he was completely correct. He was like, "Yeah, this is what I was scared of," and then he actually contacted me for lessons. So I don't know, and surprisingly, I was the teacher. So. I think in this game, no matter how principled you are, I think about sides and I want to play my second line moves. It's rather tempting to think about, well, what if white plays around here and tries to make some points, and how much is white enclosing here, and is it enough, right? And it turns out that I made the wrong judgment on this. Like, I messed up and lost the game off of this. So I decided that this side wasn't big enough because, after all, white's getting like 12 points or something, or like a bit more, and I thought, well, I don't want my opponent to attach N3. I have to go up because I need to connect my group. And he's going to go down and, like, think of all of these follow-ups later. Like, think of the, monkey jump. This is going to be amazing for him. So, I mean, of course, also it was a 20-second game, so I didn't have time to count too precisely. I was just going to say 0-12, but I thought you were asking for black instead. For both players, like, it's just which move would which player do, right? And actually, you're correct that 0-12 is a hot spot right now on the board. So I made the wrong call here. In the game, I played M2. Because, I've been, every day I get up, I review, like, the Nordic Dojo games, and I'm, like, typing furiously, corners, sides, then center, corner, sides, then center. So I was like, I'll follow my principles. And then white just attached here, and then attached here. Which, I'd actually missed this attachment, and it's a really, really nice move. So... the point is that I can't really Hane, he'll just crosscut and kill the stone. So the best I can do locally is take, like, these two stones in Gote. But, I mean, I got 6 points by doing this in Gote. It's not worth it, right? It's bigger to attach here or something, which is what I did, I think. But the point is that after I missed this move, already you start to consider the difference. Like, he closed nearly 21 points, right? And, well, you can say, well, what if I played here now? Can he still make some of those points? So I didn't erase all of those 21. Surprisingly, he has almost none of them anymore, right? Let's say here, like here. I mean, what can white do, actually? What could white even do in the center? He can play here, maybe? And jump and keep, like, 7 of them, right? But then that's still, like, a 14-point center reduction. And even though this is in the center, I completely misjudged how much he could close with one move. So I actually paid very heavily for this. And white has a very, like, white's very favorable after this. Like, when I asked the computer said, well, white has 60% before you played M2, and white has, like, 85 now. So this was unfortunate. And then I thought, okay, I'm behind on points, and I actually tried J13, and here I no-beat, and I tried, like, some ridiculous invasion, and if you look towards the end of the game, I died inside everywhere, because I was desperate for points. If a move in Yose is Sente, you don't care how much it is, you just play it. That's something that someone brought up at the beginning of the lecture, and I wanted to talk about that. It's the next topic, sort of this lecture. Which is Sente in Yose. So I wanted to conclude this part about center versus sides, because I really have seen it in a lot of Nordic Godojo games, where people overvalue the center a lot, because it looks like there's a lot of points there, which there are, but they're much harder to enclose, and that's what people don't take into account. People don't consider, well, how many moves do I need to spend to get this? And, the sides are always a much cheaper investment, and especially the corners. Correct. Whenever talking about Sente, we have to ask, how Sente is it? And here is a great segue into the next topic of this lecture, which is Sente. And I wanted to sort of start with a very I made a very basic artificial position to help start this discussion, which is here. And I wanted to start by saying, well, the motto that I follow during the endgame, the safest way to play endgame is that if you see a sente move, you play it and you get it out of the way. It's the safest, which doesn't mean it's the best. And there's a lot of caveats to that. Senteness is between 0 and 1. Well, here I wanted to discuss, what, for example, I think everyone would consider black e1 to be sente, right? It's just, it in itself it takes 1 point. If white got to play it, white would get 1 extra point. But black getting to play it is just 1 point in sente. But I want to discuss, how sente is it, right? Like, at what point is it sente? And here I wanted to draw a distinction between what I would call locally and globally sente. So something that I would call locally sente is your next move is, like, the follow-up is bigger than the move. And this is just a terminology I invented in my head that I find useful. I mean, you don't have to think about it like that, but E1 is very much gote at this point. Well, yeah, exactly. So E1 is locally sente because the follow-up is worth 14 points, right? It's worth 14 points because you capture 7, like, you save 2 stones and you capture 7. Actually, it's worth a bit less. Whoops. Like, white will Atari here and take 1 of the points, so it's actually worth 13. But it's worth 13 points. So it's definitely sente in the local sense. The follow-up is bigger. But I mean, imagine you try to play such a move in this position, white will just take the corner and laugh at you, right? Like, white's moves are actually bigger than yours. And the other thing I wanted to discuss about sente moves is that, sente moves, generally, it's hard to ascribe a value to them because you play them for free. So if you're playing something completely for free, it's arguably like a sort of infinite value, almost. Very interesting lecture, by the way. Thanks. Yeah, it's been an interesting one for me to make because the endgame is a topic that I've had to work on a lot. It wouldn't be necessarily my mega strong suit, so it was interesting to prepare. Where was I? Oh yeah, that it's hard to prescribe a value to them, but the consensus is that a sente move is worth twice as much as it's worth the same as gote moves that are twice its value. So for example, here black is gaining 1 point in sente. You'd sort of play this in the sort of situation where the only moves that are left are sort of this. Right? This is a very classic, 2-point hane, right? So black plays it, he gets a point, white loses a point. White plays it, he gains a point, black loses a point. So usually, I think by Yose theory, these two moves are equivalent. E1 and something like N1. But that doesn't change that I would very easily play E1 as black a bit earlier than the 2-point threshold. And the reason for that, potentially, is that it's safer. And this is back to the topic I mentioned before. If you ask a professional like Antti, when do you play E1? You say at the point when it's the biggest move, right? So you would play it at this stage where there are the 2-point gote moves. So the 2 times value is a rule of thumb that assumes that the move after the sente move has a similar value. So it assumes that the value, it assumes that the follow-up is bigger than any other move on the board. So that's the point of globally sente. Like for example, even though we showed an earlier situation where if black plays E1 then white doesn't care, which is like this not at all artificial position where white just gets where white will just get 2 moves on the outside, and black will only get 14 points. But imagine that this situation happens here, like in an endgame where the biggest move is worth 2 points. Then it's definitely globally sente, right? And globally sente in the sense that the follow-up is bigger than any other move. And that's when I would call a move sente. That's when it's safe to play it. And then there's, for most moves, there's a large window of time, or for a lot of sente moves, there's a pretty large window of time. I guess not always large, but there can be a large window of time between when you can play the move and it will be answered, and your opponent, and the moment when your opponent will play it in reverse sente and take away the possibility for you to play that move. So, for example, if I were black and b19 is still on the board, I wouldn't be concerned that white plays e1. Like, white's never going to play e1 as long as this exists, right? Ever. You're not going to play 1 point in reverse sente and let your opponent get away with 10 points, right? So even though if black played here, white wouldn't take 10 points because the lower left corner is bigger, it doesn't mean that you need to play it immediately. Yes, that's the reason why a move is sente, because the follow-up is bigger than any other move on the board. But I was referring to the rule, sente move has a 2 times value. I think the reason that a sente move has a 2 times value is that the moment when it's considered fine to play a reverse sente move, regardless of the value of the follow-up, it doesn't, as long as the follow-up is bigger than anything else on the board, that's enough. That's enough to consider it a sente move, and in that sense, all sente moves are equal. Because if the follow-up is bigger, then white will answer. So it doesn't really matter. It's not relative to the value of the follow-up, as long as the value of the follow-up is big enough. The point is that, and the reason it's considered times 2 is that the correct time to play it is by consensus when there are moves twice as big as that sente move available on the board. When there are only moves twice as big as that sente move on the board. So, I've sort of lost my train of thought. Okay, thanks. Yeah, no problem. So, so the other thing I wanted to mention about sente moves is that even though when I'm in Byoyomi and when I'm tired and when I'm not, when I've just played a long game, I won't play an endgame move at the precise timing. I won't play E1 at the 2-point threshold. I won't play E1 when the next biggest move is M1, which is probably what Antti would do, because Antti is a professional and Antti is, he plays endgame theory, right? And, that's something that I'm working towards, but that's something that I'm not there, quite there. I'm not quite there yet. But there is an intermediate to when you should play sente moves, because there are also drawbacks to playing sente moves that we can discuss in a moment. The value of the follow-up also has to be bigger than the follow-up of any other endgame move, or else you go into mutual destruction. That's actually a good point. I hadn't really considered that. True. But on the other hand, you could say that when I said that the follow-up has to be bigger than the follow-up of any other move, if there's a move with that equal follow-up, then that statement isn't correct anymore. Right? Because the value of a move the follow-up is included in the value of the move. So I'd assume that that's a calculation you already made before playing your sente move. Anyway, what I wanted to look at next is I wanted to go to a game I'd shown earlier as an example of an early endgame. And the reason is that I wanted to discuss some of the pros of playing, what happens if you play sente moves too early, and what happens if you don't play sente moves until it's too late. So let's go to let's go to here. And actually we can go a bit earlier, I think. So let's go here to this point. Here I'd say that the game is already arguably in the end game. And I think what black did here is completely fine. So h18 is a huge move, and it's sente. And already, you know, we're not going to count here because that's not the point of the lecture. But if I were to play like k3 or something, I would actually start to be worried that white is going to play here. No, another league game. This is another NGD league game. I showed this earlier as an example of a game where endgame started very soon, and I wanted to come back to it because I thought that there were some good endgame principles hidden in it. Yeah. Oh, C2's a bit late. Well, welcome anyway. So, if I were black, I would instinctively be concerned that white's going to attach here in reverse sente, and this is huge, right? It has all kinds of follow-ups for white. You know, reverse sente, so, you know, we would agree that it's worth twice the value. So, as black, I would also just take care of this. I think it's a good timing to do that. The other type of move I wanted to address is double sente moves, which are about to happen here. So here, black haned a16, and, you know, here it's actually doubtful whether the follow-up is big enough. It's about big enough. It's barely big enough. But the same applies to white, actually. White could play this sente move here, and the follow-up is also, instinctively, I would say it's big, but is it big enough? I'm not sure. And without counting it. Here is when, you know, when I count it because I'm not sure. And the point of sente moves is that it's very rare that there is... Oh, sorry, the point with double sente moves is that it's very rare that there are any actual double sente moves. An actual, real double sente move would be one where the follow-up is equally big for both players. So then both players are supposed to play it at the same time. And then it's a coin toss which one is going to get it, right? And in most situations, one move is more sente for one side than the other. Like, imagine that there's a move worth 1 point, and one side has, like, it's sente for one side because he has a follow-up of 3 points. But the other side but the first guy has a follow-up of 10 points. The person that has the 10-point follow-up will get to play that sente move. You know? And the one with the bigger follow-up always gets the move, assuming correct play. And this is actually an interesting example, because both of the follow-ups are roughly equal. Like, you'd have to count quite precisely to figure out which is larger. And, you know, I'd say that probably, if I had to guess, I'd say that black's follow-up is a bit larger. So I think it's correct that black got it. But I think it's also right timing for black to get it, because it's starting to be the time when white would be like, that sente move looks kind of nice for me. And the game continued. Black played these moves. I think that this is sort of declaring that the end game has been entered, if you know what I mean, because it's completely settling the black group. This move, it's sort of sente because it, you know, like, let's say white doesn't answer. I might be worried about something like this, right? So it's, you know, I'd say it's still part of, like, it's still fine. This hane, as we've discussed this hane before, it's really big. Earlier during the lecture, we actually mentioned this hane. It is amazingly big. It's not, strictly speaking, sente, but say, for example, white hane, and then black, like, didn't answer or something. To be fair, b9 is a very big move as well. So if I didn't play on the lower side, I would play on the left. Like, this move is huge. So, like, let's say black ignores again and, I don't know, plays some move. Then this clamp is a huge follow-up. And, you know, maybe the best black can do is something like this. Not like this, like this. And then white took a huge chunk out of black's corner. So just instinctively, I'd say, well, this hane is worth playing. you know? So just in terms of endgame principles, I like black's move. This move of white's I actually don't like very much. I think it should have been at b10. And so here both players like spent a move playing on, I think, an area that isn't so big. The reason black's move isn't so big is because of Sente and Goche. White b10 is Sente. So white already got something from it. And I'd say that in general, both players up to this point, white actually chose to play here, which is not strictly speaking necessary as a follow-up, but it's actually big, so it's fine. And both players have done a very good job in this endgame in general. Of course, there have been some imprecisions, right? I think notably M2 is a bit of an imprecision. But black played his Sente moves, black played the big second line Hane, white played b10, which was the next biggest point on the board. And most crucially, everyone is ignoring the center. Like, this center is worth nothing, and the reason it's worth nothing, like, and by nothing, I mean nothing. Like, really nothing. It's super small. Because everyone has strong groups facing the center. Like, if we look at, if you remember the situation I looked at in my, from the game I played online, where my opponent suddenly made this big, like, territory in the center, he had the framework to do that. In this situation, nobody has any framework to do anything in the center. So, in this board, you know, you might even play the first line moves before anything in the center. Like, before you dare go, like, higher than the 6th line, you know? So this is quite an extreme example of a singularly small center. And I think both players actually understood that quite well. And I did want, however, to go to one of those funny dumbest center games. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I had a game where I actually thought of showing this as an example against a 5-dan, where I was slightly behind in endgame, and he started playing in like some center area of this type. And in the review, he told me, like, it's so big, and I started playing second line moves, and I won by like 8 points or something in the end. So it's hard for you guys to agree with me because I'm not showing you the SGF, but yeah, that was another one of those funny dumbest center games. I wanted to shortly go to another point in the game here, when I think this is the point, yeah. When I would ask, like, here, what is the next move for both players? I think that there's, like, well, actually, I mean, it is white's turn, so, like, what would you be interested in doing if you were white? L15. L15? Okay. L15 is a bit of a mysterious move to me. What's the idea? Like, maybe you're looking to connect so that you make these 2 extra points, P16, right? Like, you want, A and B, you want them to become points. And I mean, that is worth something, but I wouldn't say it's worth that much. I'll give you an example. So let's say that white, you know, let's just throw a random stone for white. I didn't notice Q16, silly me. Oh, okay, never mind. Yeah, it's quite a small move. For anyone, I would consider J1 and A11. You know, J1 and A11 are exactly the moves I would consider. So J1 is one of those Sente moves that it's actually deceptively big already. We've already discussed the center is not really very big this game. So what is the value of a move in the center? Not much. Here, this move was worth 1, 2, 3. And this is a very like common shape, so I do want to discuss like 3. What the value of the points are here. It's very common that this kind of first line sente is worth 3 points in 3 points in sente, so worth 6 points, and it's a very common endgame shape, which I think is worth knowing by heart. No. So black can ignore J1 and do A10. That's the next topic that J1 and do A10. I think, yeah, that's actually a good point, and that's the next thing we're going to come to. Can't white still attack N12 somehow? So, in fact, I think white had a very similar thought process to Dekros, because white played here in the game, which I think is a mistake. And I think white was also sort of eyeing, like, oh, maybe I can do something to this group. But, I mean, if you consider... Just consider, if white ever tries to kill this group, this is Sente. And I don't even see a way to locally take the eyes of this group. B13 makes A11 Sente. That's an interesting idea. Actually, A11 Sente is Sente. A11 is already Sente. I'll show you what. But I don't see a way to even... Like, black will Tanuki. Black's locally fine. Alive, I think. Like, okay, say black Tanukis. White, like, this is not a good move. Just some random move. So, you know, say white peeps or something. And, like, white really goes crazy and he's like, I take all your eye shape. Come on, this is a Geta. Like, black's group is way too strong. It's really not possible to attack it. It's just a lie. So I think white sort of played under the impression that maybe the group would be weak, and that maybe the center would be big, but both of these propositions are not really the case. So, in fact, as pointed out, the two really urgent points on this board are J1 and A11. And if we go to the option of J1, which we discussed earlier, it's locally Sente. So this move was, you know, white secured 3 points, right? If black ignores and doesn't connect, right? White will play here, 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 and, you know, here, and then black will have to connect. And suddenly white got one, like, let's point them out, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points in Sente. So the follow-up is rather big. I mean, to be fair, black could choose to not defend here and lose 6 extra points in Goche, so that's another follow-up. But in fact, the follow-up is worth exactly the move itself. So I guess it's Sente. So white does have this follow-up, but there's a problem with the idea of this follow-up, which is that A10/A11 is a very tempting Tanuki for black. Because black can say, well, I'm going to lose, you know, 6 points in Sente here, but this is, actually this, well, it's not 6 points in Sente, it's 6 points with a follow-up of 6 points, so it's 9 points. I'm going to lose 9 points, but I myself am going to get this, and then probably something like this would happen. I guess. And I would say this is actually difficult to judge. It just, if you're not counting, if you're like, well, what is the order of, like, which moves is biggest? White's not sure. So by far the safest thing white can do is to play this in Sente first, and then play J1, right? Which is, I think, something that somebody already suggested. So, you know, off the top of my head, I don't know whether it's correct for black to ignore this. Because white has a follow-up of, like, 9 points, black's follow-up here is worth, like, 7 points. You know, black played that Hane in reverse Sente. It's all very confusing, right? It's a Pandora's box of endgame variations. So, you know, if you need to calculate that in a game to win it, you'll try. But white doesn't need to do any of that. White can also push at h3 later. Yeah, true. Yeah, H3 is interesting. I hadn't really thought about that actually. To make it even more complicated. Yeah, indeed, you have a good point there. But the way white can very easily avoid all of these complications is to play A11 first. So just play here, and the reason this is sent, by the way, this is like a bit of endgame reading, I guess. There's also reading involved in the endgame, of course, which is not something we've really addressed. Like Yosei Tsujis are an important part of the game, but let's say that black ignores, white can just kill like this, and black's dead. Now black might try to get clever and push and then Tanuki, but then you just kill it this way. So that didn't end well. In fact, white has an even cooler way to kill now. And actually, I mean, in this case, white has two ways to kill, but I know a situation where a friend of mine used this Tetsuji. You throw in here. So yeah, this is just cool. But yeah, and I remember like 4 years ago or something, a friend of mine played this Yosei Tetsuji inside his opponent's territory and won because of it. That was very cool. So anyway, I thought you wanted to show Kosumi. Does Kosumi also work? I guess Kosumi works as well. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, everything works, I guess. Yeah, this Kosumi works. True. And that's also cool. Yeah, true. So, going back to here, I think white could play J1, but I mean, even by the principle of biggest move, J1 is smaller, right? So, and the reason it's smaller than A11 is that black playing this K1 endgame has no follow-up. There's nothing. It's done, right? It's just no follow-up whatsoever. If black plays it, he has a very big follow-up, right? And therefore, I think just by, I don't need to know the precise move value, but I know that A11 is the biggest move on the board, but by far, at this point. And I think, actually, in my opinion, both players could have taken care of this move earlier. Like, I think starting here, both players should. Like, for example, here, I think black could very easily have played this, and okay, he'll suffer, like, some endgame follow-up, but this is, like, acceptable. I mean, maybe it's acceptable. It's sort of what we looked at earlier. But it's an interesting question whether black should Hane at this point. He definitely shouldn't connect. I thought connect was a bit of a slow move. Funnily enough, I think the best move locally is Nobi. Because this attachment will never work. Because black's too thick. So white can only Hane anyway. And then, A is better than B, right? So it's just... So if you want to prevent the clamp, you probably Nobi like this, as ugly as it looks. Anyway, that's a bit off topic. So yeah, I thought... I did want to make a point out of this game because I thought both players played the endgame relatively well. Like, they took care... Like, up until this move, they both took care of the sides. They took care of, like, big-ish center moves. But eventually, both players... Like, they ignored this A11. It was pretty mysterious because they played, black played this, and white played this, and black played this. They all, like, they seem to have this correct idea of, well, these points are biggest. And then they avoided the vital point for super long until black got it. And actually, at this point, it's like, the difference is huge. Like, the difference between this move and any other endgame move is huge at this point. And also something else I will point out is that you can see that nobody has made any points in the center yet. They've played a lot of moves, but nobody's made any points. And it's not even clear how somebody could even hope to make some points in this center. Like, maybe the best that you can do... the best you can do to make points in the center is something like, I don't know, here or something, and enclose like 3 extra points or something. So, yeah, this center was a singularly small one. But yeah, I thought that would be a nice, in-practice example. Also, unfortunately for Black, even though, I was, I really liked what Black did. He played here, Sente, and these Sente exchanges they can't have a negative. There are some Sente exchanges, for example, imagine that you're white, and you push here. This exchange has negative repercussions. And this is something that, this actually relates to the topic of my previous lecture, which was on bad exchanges, right? You need to consider before you make an exchange whether what you're doing is intelligent or not, whether the exchange is good. And in Endgame, there are some exchanges that are good, but they still have drawbacks. So what a professional will tell you is you wait to make the Sente exchange until it's worth it for your opponent to play it in reverse Sente, because you want to keep your options open, because many exchanges have negative consequences, so you sort of want to hold on to the option of not playing it. My practical experience as someone who has played a depressing amount of Byoyomi games is that you should be a bit safer than that. You should find a middle ground where you play Sente moves with a bit of comfortable room that your opponent won't play them in reverse Sente, and you will lose the opportunity to play the move. You also shouldn't play it immediately, as soon as you can. Maybe White missed that it was Sente for them, so they treated it as a Black's, right? Well, I think even if it weren't White Sente, it would be a very valuable reverse Sente move. Because at some point, and a way to play makes a good point, if you make all of your Sente exchanges in Yose that you don't need to make, for example, you will lose Ko's. So that's one drawback of them as a whole. So actually, if we go back to this position, and maybe White missed that it was Sente for them, I think, let's go to the point here where White could have played it. Regardless of whether it's Sente or not, imagine that it was just 1, 2, 3 points in Gote. Black's follow-up to this is worth 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's worth 6 points. So this move is Black's Sente. If White doesn't play it, it's Black's Sente. Now, funnily enough, if White's move is Sente, then Black's move isn't Sente, in a way. Because, if A11 is Sente, then A10 has a much larger value. So locally, I think the follow-up will be smaller. Does that make sense? It's a very funny, relationship. So if A11 isn't Sente, then A10 is Sente, which is very funny. But in any case, it's still the biggest move on the board. How do you remember those Sente moves and get them right? I feel like I missed the timing for them a lot. Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, right? There are games where for example, there are games where I've held on to playing a monkey jump. Monkey jumps are huge, right? We all know monkey jumps. You get a lot of points from playing them. There are games where I've held on to them, forgotten them, and I lost the game by half point because I didn't play a monkey jump once. And I thought of showing that as an example of the repercussions that not playing a Sente exchange can give. So it's I can't exactly say how do you remember those Sente moves, because you need to find your own balance of not playing them. If you want to be really safe, if you want to be really safe, the safest way is just what are my Sente moves? Let's play all of them, right? But if you want to as soon as you want to find a compromise between those, it's tough. what's the reason for not playing a monkey jump, not being sent there? Well, the reason I didn't play a monkey jump is that it wasn't yet correct for him to defend, like, to prevent my monkey jump in reverse gote. That's the reason. But it would have been safer to just get the monkey jump out of the way. Of course, a better endgame player than me would remember the monkey jump at the right timing and play it. But I wasn't a better endgame player. Maybe now I'm a better endgame player, but at the time I wasn't, and I lost because of it. Not sente because sente moves make the making follow-up bigger, so if yours is sente, then the initial... Wait, I'm trying to digest Telegraphical's comment. Wait. Yeah, it's not sente because sente means follow-up is bigger. So yours, so yours is sente. Yeah, exactly. I think you interpreted it, what I meant correctly. So, I think we can agree that A11 is bigger if it's sente. So, well, it's a confusing idea. That's why the comment is confusing. Because I think he agrees with me. So, we can agree that the follow-up, like, if A11 is gote, like, in a hypothetical world where A11 is gote, then A11 is smaller, correct? If A11 is smaller, then A10 is smaller, correct? And if A10 is smaller, according to my counting, which is not very precise, probably, at the moment, like, I'm probably not doing it perfectly or anything, then B9 is actually bigger than A10. So, like, imagine in this world where black had this move. B9 is now bigger than A10 was. So, it's sente. You know? So that's the interesting thing. That at this point, A10 is bigger, so B9 is, strictly speaking, not locally sente. And in the game, if we go back to the game, when eventually black played this move, this is a move that locally isn't sente, because the follow-up is smaller than the move, but globally it's mega sente, because now B9 is still bigger than every other move on the board, by far. And I think that's a good sign that the players did something wrong. You know? Like, locally the move shouldn't be sente, but you still have to answer it. So that's a very bad sign. You know, someone didn't play endgame correctly. Now, I don't want to bash the players too much because they actually played endgame very nicely up until now. This was a small slip-up they made. So I think in general it was a nice game. Unfortunately, black was just behind at the start of this endgame, and because both of them played rather well, then white just won by 5 points in the end. So, but yeah, I think that's probably about all for the lecture. I think I ran over the two important concepts that I wanted to get across, which is sente moves in Yose, and why the center is smaller than most people think it is. Yeah, that cat one lecture, Pog. Hello, Apologo. So I think I ran through the two main topics that I wanted to show, and I also wanted to demonstrate this endgame as an example of the people playing using endgame principles where they used them well and where they didn't. And I also wanted to keep this lecture as untechnical as possible and not counting too much, because in practice, most people aren't going to be counting the value of endgame moves to a perfect T during their games. You know, it's already quite hard for someone like me if I'm in Byoyomi and I need to read for, you know, you still need to read in Yose, and you still need, you know, you're counting and you're, you know, it's a hectic situation, and counting correctly is hard. So having a set of just ideas that will carry you through the endgame, even if you don't know the exact value of the moves. Like, for example, White doesn't need to know when he plays here whether black can counterattack with this. He can just play this first, and he'll be fine. And he knows he will be fine. If he's just applying, like, you know, if he's just using the safety of Sente, in this case. So yeah, that about does it for my lecture. I think, does anyone have any questions, anything else they want to bring up? Because otherwise, I think I will probably be off. It was an interesting lecture to make because Endgame is not, strictly speaking, my forte. It's something that I've had to improve slowly, especially in the last year or so. And I'm still not good enough to count the endgame values precisely when I'm in Byoyomi, you know? Maybe after the game I'll be able to. Like, after the game I'll review it, and I'll be able to know what the correct endgame was, but not during the game. It's too hard. So, when will you next stream? That's a good question, though not related necessarily to the topic. I'm actually streaming tomorrow. A bit of a special event, but I'll be streaming tomorrow morning. Yeah, you'll see why, I guess. But yeah, so not many questions being brought up. I think I might end it here. Yeah, I don't know. Thanks for watching, guys. Was a fun lecture, I think, on a less common topic. So yeah, thanks for watching. See you guys. Oh, how did I improve my endgame? Okay, that's a good question. How did I improve my endgame? Jeff told me these endgame principles, and I followed them during games. Actually, that's actually what I did. Like, I mean, first of all, nowadays when I play an endgame, I usually spend time reviewing the endgame afterwards and finding out the value of moves. But the way it really helped me to improve was the fastest way I got a bit of patchwork into my endgame was to apply these principles. Like, center doesn't matter much usually. Efficiency of moves is important. You know, how to use Sente. So it's sort of this lecture is sort of how I improved. So yeah, I think it might be useful to you guys as well. Yeah, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you around.